The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Very good morning and good afternoon to everyone that's joining for this webinar. And it's a masterclass part 2 about fraud, food fraud. And I'm very pleased that we are here. And I can already see a lot of attendees coming in. So thank you very much for joining us. And we are excited that we are talking now. We go a bit deeper in the material about food fraud. And today our guest speaker is David Psomiadis. And I'm your moderator, Louke Koopmans. I'm working for CBI as a sector account manager for natural ingredients. David, thank you so much for joining us. Could you share a bit more about yourself?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you very much, Louke. Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here again. And it's a pleasure that we can go a little bit deeper following our first session. So my name is David Psomiadis. I am the head of the lab and business development manager at Imprint Analytics, a service provider here in Austria, supporting the industry, governments and associations in the topic of food fraud and food authenticity. And today we will follow up our previous session and get to some very specific points that can help our attendees.
Wonderful. So let's start for today. So CBI is your host for today. And what CBI is doing, we do basically 3 things. One, it's about market access support. So we have projects in 16 countries. Then we have sector transition support. So we're also supporting sectors to change, for instance, in the ginger sector, in apparel. So we're working in 16 sectors. And we provide a lot of market intel. So if you go to our website, you can also find a lot of market studies, which are updated on a very regular basis and are really made by experts in the field. So today's session is part of our market access and market intel. So for today's session, please be aware that this will be a masterclass. We can't see you, we can't hear you. And please use the questions in the question pane. There's opportunity to ask a lot of questions like last time. David will answer them. Hopefully we can answer all of them. We're trying all our best. Again, we really want to make it interactive. So for the ones that just joined us, thank you so much for joining our masterclass on food fraud. So basically today's section, it's about the focus is in the sector natural ingredients and herbs and spices. And why? If we look at research, and David helped us to do this, there are many cases found with food fraud in this specific categories. You could think about herbs and spices, of course, the most important ones like vanilla and saffron, but also natural ingredients, there happens food fraud. But basically in many sectors, there are cases happening. But what is important that we want you, the Food and Drug Administration, sector associations, companies, consultants, NGOs, all of you that are here, that you are helping to reduce food fraud. So that means that you make good analysis, you are driving for compliance, for control, but also it's about building trust with importers and consumers. And you can play a key role in taking this role, in reducing food fraud. Consequences of food fraud is, of course, the bigger picture that we want to stop. We want to stop or improve, let's say, health risk for consumers. We want to increase that importers and exporters are able to trade and are less stopped by customs. Imagine what I mentioned last time. If you want to export spices from Ethiopia, there's a 50% check. Of course, that's something that we can reduce together. Also, it's to stop food waste, because of rejected batches that are sent back, we want to reduce. And as well, we want you to support a positive country image that people and importers want to import from your country. So that's the reason why we have this masterclass today. So let's dive into the content today. So it's important that we would like you to understand how to make a good risk analysis. Secondly, that you get an understanding how to get access to food fraud. Thirdly, understand authentication tools and their applications. So what does it really mean? And then, of course, conclude also with the perception of food authenticity and food culture. So last time we had a lot of lessons learned, and thank you so much for all the assignments that were sent in. We received 20 assignments from you. I think that's really well appreciated. And today we also will dive into this one. So as an agenda, we will start first with a wrap-up of previous session. Then we dive into the assignment 1 about food fraud vulnerability. Then we go to assignment 2 about the authentication program. And then we talk more about the holistic approach. There's Q&A at the end, but there's also room for questions in between. I will just interrupt you, David, because we're so keen to hear all about your expertise about this topic of food authenticity. So let's first dive into a wrap-up of previous session. Personally, I learned a lot about food fraud. In actually the Dutch language, we call it voedselzekerheid. So that could be freely translated as food purity. Like if I buy something as a consumer, I want to be sure what's in the pack. So I want to be sure it's authentic, that is sold to me as a consumer. So David, I'm keen to hear maybe in a couple of minutes to hear more about the food integrity and the food fraud of last time you shared.
Sure, absolutely.
So if you can share your screen, would be great. Yeah.
Of course. Thank you very much, Louke, for your introduction. You described very well what is actually the purpose of this masterclass and what we expect to have not only as attendees or as participants, but also as stakeholders into the area that involves the consumer, and probably above all, and we are all consumers, but also all the stakeholders into the chain from producing food, manufacturing, and distributing food, but also all the agencies and associations around the industry that are responsible to make sure that the food that has been exported or imported or going under certain controls to comply with regulations is safe, delivers the quality that it promises, but also speaks the truth to the consumer. So when we think about a buyer that purchases any product and the expectation that the product delivers the characteristics that it should have into its specifications, we need to make sure that all these factors and all these principles are secured. And we will see how during the day and this session we will go around this topic and take the points that will make sure that at the end we will see that picture again and understand that the puzzle cannot be split up to many pieces, or if we do that, then we need to put the pieces back to the same puzzle to speak about food integrity. So food that has all these characteristics and principles that makes it the food that we expect to have on our dish. Going very quickly on a few points that we discussed in the previous session, but opening up the picture and offering the field for further questions or discussions. We need to remember that food fraud is a crime. It is a criminal act. And I remember from the last session, many people that were asking about what could be the penalty or what could be the consequence when someone has been caught performing food fraud. And to get a very simple understanding of that, we need to be in the shoes of the criminal. So practically, either is food fraud or is drug smuggling or gun illegal trade or black market. Everything starts from some principles. So how easy is to perform the criminal act? Or what is the profit margin? So if I do this criminal activity, do I get enough profit to take the risk? And that risk is the likelihood of being caught. And we discussed in the last session also that this likelihood is kind of decreased today because there is confusion about food fraud. The industry itself feels sometimes fear when food fraud is on the table regarding their company, and also how we have the tendency to depreciate the terms and the consequences of food fraud. So if we take that list and we put it on this balance, we understand that it's not strange that food fraud is probably the most lucrative business for criminals regarding the risks, the penalties, and of course the profits that they can get through this criminal activity. What we have to do, definitely, is to be prepared. And being prepared is not, it does not mean that we need to wait until food fraud hits on our door. We need to understand risks, to identify these risks, and this happens through assessments, risk or vulnerability assessments. We need to classify our risks, so to see how the risks are relevant to our industry, our company, or our country. And in order to be proactive, we need to move on and produce some authentication data. That means that we need to use measures and mechanisms that can help us be ready or be sure that our procedures and our mechanisms are safe enough. And this has an outcome, and this outcome is better to be communicated, so we can build on food culture, we can build on awareness, and as well as make sure that our clients, who are at the end of the line, the consumers, are feeling trust on food. Most food fraud happens between businesses, so it's difficult to believe that countries as a whole would make efforts to produce food fraud. And between businesses means that from a producing company to distributing or exporting or retail companies might be involved in food fraud. And the penalties till today have been proven that might not be sufficient. Sometimes they are, but sometimes they have the regulatory agencies face difficulties to prove the extent of the criminal act, and so to incur the respective penalties. And at the end, the question is, do businesses cut corners, or at the end of the day, they will go out of business? Let's start with some interaction. Maybe it's good to have the first poll now. And for that, I will just place the first poll for you. And I would like you please to answer to the question: what do you think? Who is most affected by food fraud, considering the consequences? The food industry itself, so taking everyone, every stakeholder, manufacturers, retailers, distributors, etc., or the consumers, so we as consumers that we purchase food and we consume food? Or is it really restricted to the primary producers, the farmers, for example, that they start with their own product, with its quality and its value, and then it goes through the line and the fraud happens later on? So please take your time and answer this question. It's very important to think about maybe an incident of fraud or many incidents of fraud in a sector, and then rewind a bit and think about, at the end, who will be most affected, who will lose more.
Yeah, interesting question, David. I'm keen to hear what everyone is thinking. What comes to my mind is as well, let's say, who is responsible for food fraud, but it's good to think who is indeed affected by food fraud. So shall we bring the poll to the screen?
Sure.
To see if everyone answered? Aha, interesting. So I can see 56% of consumers are affected by food fraud, about getting chemicals in their bodies or other wrong stuff. 32% the food industry itself, and 12% the primary producers. David, can you share, like, why is the food industry itself it's affected? I can imagine, let's say, like lost money of rejected batches, like things they can't use. But what else is affecting them?
Yes, of course. Indeed, very interesting your answers. And I would say that here we don't look for the correct answer, but probably what is your opinion, because at that point that we are now, we understand that all these three groups are indeed affected. And the food industry might have the most significant financial losses, direct losses, like you said, but also indirect losses through this general picture that the buyer, which includes a lot of the consumers, will have at the end as an impact due to food fraud. This comes through scientific research, which has proven that consumers have the tendency to lose the trust to products because there are either incidents or rumors about food fraud and fraudulent activities. That means that the price of premium products with many claims lose their value, and the consumers would not possibly choose a product from the premium lines just because they stop believing the claims. And that's an indirect consequence that affects the industry or a whole segment without being necessarily a company under the investigation for food fraud.
And David, like, why would the primary producers be affected? Does it mean there's less sourced from the farmers?
This is again a phenomenon that might affect even whole regions or even countries. So we have, for example, identified that a country which has a significant production on a certain commodity, and when that product has a high risk of adulteration in global trade or in global supply chains, the demand for that product will decrease, which means that the primary producers will have difficulties to sell their product either to domestic markets or to export the product. And it might lead really to significant impacts on certain areas and certain production lines, which might be catastrophic for the economy of that sector.
Thank you so much. So let's maybe move to next part, because now we're keen to hear about whose responsibility is it to detect food fraud and to minimize the risks.
Sure. So we have split the presentation or the masterclass in two parts now that will touch the assignments that we set up in the last session. Of course, we will discuss over your feedback, but we'll go through some points to get to the point of how we, in that case, build up our food fraud vulnerability assessment. This table here indicates shortly and briefly how a risk analysis or a need analysis has been made regarding regions of interest, products, in that case you see herbs and spices and natural ingredients, which is the focus of this masterclass, and then picking up risks that have been identified in different areas and for different products. It's obvious that some of these products are really significant for the respective region, while the same product might not be so interesting for another region. And the reason is the value of the geographical provenance of the product, or the value of the demand in global markets for certain products from specific regions, and of course, certain production from there. The most common issues that might affect these two groups, these two categories, is to have issues with the purity of the material, especially when we are talking about powders, spices, for instance, or cases that we have undeclared ingredients, sometimes to improve sensory characteristics, so simply to improve taste or quality, or sometimes to keep products in certain conditions, so to keep them lasting longer or to keep them looking better. And although these are obviously not allowed to take place. How do we build our risk assessment? How do we know these factors? The first one, beyond the sources that you see on this slide, is our own knowledge. So when we are an operator into a certain region, we know very well that certain products and certain categories have higher value. This is already a very important source of information about what might go wrong with that specific product. Further on, of course, there are sources, global sources, public or not public sources, that someone can collect information about what is happening out there. So apart from our own classification of products that might go under risk for fraud, I need to read also what is happening on this product or on similar products in my region or globally. And this comes through different databases that they monitor incidents, they monitor records, and they identify risks. Let's see one of your assignments that I received back, and this comes from Ghana, and thank you very, very much again for all your feedback and all your exercises that you produced in a very well manner and in a quite complete level, I would say. And it's always interesting to identify the information that has been put in these assessments. So starting from the group, we need indeed to define the product group. It could be different categories or more categories. And then going through this list, which is only indicative and very simple way to produce a food fraud vulnerability assessment, we start from products that are relevant to that region. So we can accept from this submission that these products in that list are relevant to the market of Ghana as a producing region. And then we move on to see some characteristics that might be value-giving and or might be a reason to avoid the product. For instance, it's very obvious that the monosodium glutamate was a topic for many of you. And this indicates that especially for spices and spice mixtures, it is very important for a lot of regions that you send your assignments to make sure that that specific ingredient, so MSG, is not added to the products. And it's also very well written. Why is that? So there is, as we see here, wide price difference between MSG-free spice versus spices with MSG. And this information is very probable that comes from the experience of the people in the specific region. It doesn't mean that it's a global issue. It could be, of course, but it doesn't really mean it's a global issue. But it is a very important point to look for into the specific region, especially for exporting characteristics. And identifying that as a very important point, the risk gets higher. And the outcome is that I have highlighted through my assignment, through my assessment, that for two products, ground cumin and curry powder, I need to take action in order to make sure that they do not contain MSG.
And thank you, David. Maybe it might also be interesting to add the target group, like whether your product is for domestic consumers or maybe for the international markets, because that might even give a different picture, what we look at today.
Absolutely, absolutely, and might even bring more risks or risks that might be unknown to me as a local operator. And this is the combination or the aim of the combination of our experience, our knowledge, and the resources that we can get this information about what is really happening or what are the demands and the requirements from the importing regions in the world. And as you said very correctly, this might bring a very different picture or a broader picture about how our perspective should be regarding the risks that we have to deal with. For example, I see on that list garlic powder. And as a characteristic here, organic has been chosen, which brings more value to the product. And at the end, the recognition of the risk comes from the difference between organic garlic powder and conventional or non-organic powder. So it's a very important topic, organic farming in all around the world, especially for markets like Europe or North America, where organic products gain more and more value on the market and more share on the markets. On the other hand, there are several issues of origin mislabeling of garlic and garlic powder around the world. So we have, in the last year, we have seen incidents where garlic powder indicated certain geographical origin on a package or on a lot, which proved to be not true, or simply this origin couldn't be traced into the whole system of documentation and certification along the supply chain. So what is the problem here? That when you lose traceability about a product and you are not sure about its origin, then suddenly all risks might pop up, because you don't know anymore if every certificate that you have for that product is true or not. We'll have the chance to see another assignment of food fraud vulnerability assessment, and I can give a few more comments about many assessments that we received in the last few days, and we can have also a summary about that. So we understood that we can get information from our own knowledge, and we can identify certain frequencies or trends through global records that are monitored and registered into global databases and resources. Then we have incidents, natural sometimes incidents, or human-induced incidents that might affect the risk of fraud for certain products. A couple of years ago, we had very intense climatic incidents in the area of Madagascar and generally the Southeast Africa. And this had an immediate impact on the production of vanilla. And as Madagascar is one of the most major producing regions for vanilla, including the value of Madagascan vanilla, the impact to the risk of adulteration of vanilla products, substituting Madagascan vanilla with other regions or with artificial vanillins, it was immediately spotted from risk assessments, and this was added up to the existing huge price difference between authentic vanilla versus natural vanillins, so vanillins produced from other raw materials, but still that can bring the claim of natural flavorings according to, for instance, EU or US regulations. And then the products, the synthetic vanillins, which cannot be mentioned as natural flavorings on a product description. Price might be an incidence. We've seen that weather can be a root cause, but there are so many others that we need to keep our eyes open. Here are some examples of relatively recent incidents and cases that have impacted the risk of fraud for certain commodities around the world. So for instance, avoiding regions, so companies try to avoid regions that they might have been documented as areas of higher probability of child labor or of labor slavery, or regions that will have extended risk of deforestation for producing these crops or products. Very recently, we've all heard about the issue in the Suez Canal that has been blocked. That meant that hundreds or even maybe thousands of marine routes have been affected to bring goods from one corner of the world to the other. That had an immediate impact on the availability of goods in certain regions, and that means that the distributors that were expecting these goods had an issue that they have to cover their supply. And this is a very important risk factor for moving on to fraud, cutting corners and finding other resources without going into the procedure, the proper procedure, to verify that these resources are trustful, let alone the procedure to open up a new description and explain why this happened and what is the new source. So the most probable way is that supplies might be covered up with products from other regions or from other sources, or sometimes from less trustful sources and suppliers. We understand here that all these factors might influence the risk of fraud from a longer term perspective to a very, very short term. During the last year, apart from our personal lives that have been affected from the pandemic globally, the food supply chains have been also affected. We had a very strong disruption in the global food systems, and that was a very different weight between different regions. So we had cases that we had a surplus of production because they simply couldn't be exported or moved to another region because of the restrictions. On the same time, we had reduced supervision because simply people couldn't move and survey the local procedures and mechanisms by inspection, by auditing, by taking samples for testing. There were labor shortages in farming. Many regions in the world depend on farmers from cross borders regions, and that was impossible to happen during last year. And into that process, we had also the consumers changing their behavior, their purchasing behavior, either because they had to choose another way to purchase food or different ways to decide about which food they had to choose. Or in the very beginning, sometimes it also have been observed that people have the tendency to change purchasing goods from very fresh production to longer term products that they could store. And producing an extreme economic environment, causing shortages in global supply chains, and expecting shortcuts in prevention and mitigation measures has, I would say, a quite difficult situation as a recipe to risks, certain risks, of course, safety risks, but also food fraud risks. A good chance to present another food fraud vulnerability assessment that we received from you, one of the first ones. This comes from Ethiopia, and we also see here a focus on certain products. The group and category refers to food and beverage, which is quite wide, but we see on the list that we have very different products. Let's focus on the materials that they really belong to the categories that we are mostly interested, so natural ingredients and herbs and spices. And indeed, here we have very good examples. For me, the teff flour is really a very good example because it is a product with a very specific value for the specific region. It might not be so interesting for a producer or a food operator in another country, but for Ethiopia, this product has definitely a value, not only domestic value, but also exporting value. And that means that any kind of risk that might affect that product is not only financially important to identify, but it could be also in a macroeconomy perspective, very important to mitigate and stop from increasing as a risk into the production and exporting procedures. The risks and the problems that we might see here refer to mostly illegal or undeclared additives. Might be something that has nothing to do with the product, nothing to do with food actually. So brick powder we see dyes, or we see dust. But we might also see just replacement of the original authentic flour with others that probably have lower price and makes a lot of possibilities for fraudsters to have profits, to get profits out of replacing the original product with cheaper ones. An important factor here is that as long as we identify these risks for these products, it's very important for us to take action.
So interesting. And again, like we love to see all those assignments. But in your view, let's say I get some questions in, but who should take responsibility in doing such a vulnerability assessments? And who should actually take control of anticipating? Is this more related to the business themselves in Ethiopia? Is it the sector association, the Food and Drug Administration?
Of course, the most important segment that needs to take the action are the businesses themselves. And why is that? Because they need to secure their product. They need to secure their business, their operations. In combination to that, businesses need help. They need support and guidance. And this is usually expected from their respective associations, that they can build on certain policies and certain programs that they can help their companies actually to deal with that problem. And the regulation, the regulatory context from the food safety authorities in each country are the governmental agencies that should protect products of national value. I'm saying that because in many cases, the businesses start from the point that they will not play the role of the police. So they are not going to catch the thief or the criminal, and this is an issue of the government, which in principle sounds correct. Nevertheless, until the criminal is caught and goes to face the justice, the business might get real trouble, and protecting their own procedures is something that will help them. And actually, if we follow the most recognized global certification standards like FSSC 22000 or IFS or BRC that refer to the industry, these are commercial standards, they all refer to the requirements to deal with food fraud internally in their business. So that means that the companies practically, if they want to follow the way of certification, they have to today deal with food fraud and build their food fraud vulnerability assessment.
Okay, thank you so much. And again, may I invite all the attendees to ask your questions. But David, what I capture, like as CBI, we are supporting individual companies. We are working with a lot of sector associations. We are also working with standards organizations. But what I hear you saying is that sector associations could also play a role in making their assessment for their companies and maybe help them indeed together to improve the image of some or all important raw materials that they want to export or further develop. So I think like I can see some of you are from a sector association. So I think take your role as well and then look at how you can make this even easy vulnerability assessment to improve the sector to guarantee that you can continue exports. Great. Shall we go to one more poll? I think it's almost one is coming in,
yes,
right?
Exactly.
Yes. Wonderful. So again, we're keen to hear from your end. So what seems to be the most reliable source of food fraud intelligence? So what do you think? Where does it come from in your countries? Is it official sources from the authorities who have published records? Is it from the state and private laboratories with testing records and findings? Or is it coming from consulting companies with private databases of global hazards? So again, put your answer in. What do you think? So the most reliable source.
And this is actually very interesting to see how people are expecting to get the information from a reliable source.
That also joined last time, so great to see you again. Some people that are new today. So we're now in our masterclass part 2. Okay, David, are you able to show that poll? Because I'm quite interested to see what everyone has answered.
Yes, of course.
Oh, excellent. All right, so we can see on top 59% official sources. And then secondly, the laboratories and consulting. David, could you clarify?
Of course.
What is the right answer? Or is the no right answer? Do we need all actually?
Of course. Well, I understand that first of all, people would first trust official sources, and the word itself might cause the significance of the answer.
You're on mute.
You cannot hear me? I can hear you very well. Can you hear me?
David, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Okay, so maybe it's Louke that cannot receive. I will move on, and if you see also that you cannot hear me, please let me know. So the word itself, official sources, make people trust that source. And this is very important because they are really gathering up information and incidents. The problem here, the only problem I would say, or weakness, is that these are the published resources and published records. That means that the advantage of the laboratories is that they are having also not published records, so findings from the laboratory, which is not replacing the records that are being published, but this is additional information. The last one, the consulting companies with private databases, actually would combine the previous 2 points, or should combine. So they should collect the information from published records, and they should also get the trends from real-time findings. Of course, this might be the most costly way to do that. So starting from reading and collecting information from official resources is an extremely good point and a very good step to start with.
Thank you
Let's
so
move
much,
on.
David. Yeah,
Okay,
curious.
you can hear me back, okay. We will move on to part 3 now, where we are going to enter the next step, the next sector that we need to take care in our internal procedures. And this is how we can use an authentication program. Let me start from understanding a few issues that we have to include in our thoughts. First of all, tracing food products is of extreme importance, because at the end of the day, most, if not all, of the food fraud, the major food fraud cases that we had in the recent years had to do with traceability, for a reason that it's very clear. When we lose traceability, we are not sure what might end up on our table in our dish. And the financial impact is one thing, but the impact on public health is another, and this is the unknown that we have a very higher risk to bring into our system when we lose authenticity and traceability. Of course, we need also to keep in mind these 2 terms, traceability and authenticity. They are not the same thing. They do not refer to the same topic. And let me give you a very simple example why. When we are thinking of a food product, we need to combine the food itself with its packaging. Whatever is a package, it could be a container with certain documents, it could be a carton box, or it could be a simple piece of food with an accompanied label. What we trace today, including any kind of high-end technological traceability system or a simple documentation, a certificate, refers to the packaging, to the code numbers that we use to characterize our lot or our batches. What happens when we have fraud is that, apart from using fake certificates, we might just replace the food into the package. And this is what happens actually. No one will deliver a certificate saying that the product shouldn't have MSG, but it does. But the product itself is the item that will have the information or the intelligence of the fraud that might have happened. So authenticity is a procedure, or authentication actually is a procedure when we are testing or we are checking the product itself. We have all the claims that we need to have in our hand and need verification, and then we need to check the product. Does it really have MSG or not? This is the action to prove authenticity, while traceability, as a matter of provenance, but also as a matter of tracing all the characteristics that the product might have, come from our system, which might be a documentation system or a traceability system. The area of testing is a very important area into the authentication programs. The difficulty here is that apart from having access to certain technologies and certain testing solutions, we also have many questions when we have to deal with testing. Which method fits for the purpose? How much it costs? How precise is the result at the end? And at the end, when we have a testing or a testing result, why did it fail to detect a fraud? Because we might have a fraud incident and the method that we chose didn't succeed to detect it. Of course, it is a matter of affordability to perform it in an extended scale. Or we have also incidents that using the same method or similar methods from one lab to the other, we get different results. In this area, people need to get support and they need to have guidance how they can use recent technologies that refer to food authenticity. From our part, what can we do, or what is the information we need to look for? So we need to understand the product characteristics, and this mostly comes from the food fraud vulnerability assessment. So to understand what is the topic that we are trying to look for, we need to find the appropriate method, and for that we can ask our government laboratory or our service provider to propose and guide us. We need to make sure that we use a method not only because it's appropriate for the question, but it is also appropriate for the detection limits that we expect to have in this product and with that risk. When, where, and how often we should use that method, and what we need to do after testing. So does anyone go to jail, or do we have to dispose that batch? No, but we need to know what to do after a finding, especially when the finding is not the expected one. I summarized a few of the assignments that we received in the previous days. Unfortunately, I couldn't involve all the assignments that we got yesterday. That was quite a lot. But I do promise that we will give you a feedback into the evaluation procedure after the masterclasses. And again, I would like to thank you for all that feedback. So one example that might include several aspects is when we have a product or a new product line with certain added values. I used some added values from some assignments. I have added a few on my own, if you allow me, to explain a little bit how we approach the topic. So what is an authentication program? We need to do our certification requirements to cover up with that. We need to do auditing. We need to understand if our suppliers comply with our standards. And then we need to do our part to understand why these claims have a value, because they go on the product either as a mark or as a listed ingredient. And for each one of them, supposing that we have so many value claims, to understand the risk. So it's not only that it says vanilla, it says it's bourbon vanilla, which is even higher risk not to be bourbon vanilla. And what is a proper method, which is a more straightforward way to verify the authenticity of that claim? So the answer would be choosing the proper method. Is that claim true or not true? This might have even, in some cases, extended applications, sometimes to the packaging material or to sustainability topics that we promise over our products. Another way to see this procedure is to replace the product itself with many claims with a facility, with a process. And this might be more interesting for producers, but also for associations, that it's many times relevant to have centralized points that they deal with products from multiple suppliers. So let's say that we have incoming items and outcoming products that they are supposed to be sent out to external markets as exports, or to be distributed globally as a commodity with a certain value claim. The products might have already from their primary stage an added value, a claim that has already an added value, or sometimes the value is recognized on the outgoing part, where the products are circulating around the globe with these claims. And the risks that we need to identify, for instance, purity or geographical origin, very important point for national productions, or when we have deal with the same product like oils, edible oils, and they might have an important value claim like PDO olive oils or certain olive oils from some regions, or if we have oils that they might be blended. And in that case, we need to perform certain tests to verify that these claims are true.
David, are you able to
Yes.
hear me? Yes,
Of
wonderful.
course.
We get some questions in, like I think, first of all, indeed, do your risk analysis, see where are the highest risks, where is most volume. Let's say if your country sells a lot of saffron or sells a lot of olive oil, maybe you should focus in it specifically, let's say raw material. But the cost to do controls, to do tests, it's so expensive. So like what would you advise to companies? What would you advise to the Food Drug Administrations? Like where to start basically to do your authentication programs?
Usually, yes, of course, I understand the question, and it's really a topic that many companies or associations, they need to go deeper and understand how they should deal with that. So I would start from saying that the risk assessment is the most important part, which has not only the aim to identify the risks, but it can very possibly have also the aim to save at the end resources. How is that? So by identifying high risk products means, first of all, that I can pick really the most risky items for moving on and investigating how I can exclude the risk or mitigate that risk. On the other hand, I could also recognize procedures and products with lower risks, where saving resources, for instance, by less auditing or by most convenient procedures that they can cover up the certification requirements, for example, is making at the end a balance between the distribution of my resources in my company and then perform either testings or audits or another mechanism. It's not always these two. Now, how to understand these costs? It's up to requirements of what we need to test. So people need to ask and find the proper solution and see if these costs are relevant to their business.
And also we can see that many times the regulatory affairs people in the companies, they are of course responsible to do the additional checks whether their own products have the right claim. We have quality departments who need to ensure the quality is procured in the right way. So there are different roles in companies basically. But again, like if you're a smaller company, it's more difficult. Like what is your advice if you have a very small company, like where to start? If you think about people in your company, where should you invest in your company?
I think here comes the very important role of associations, because it's true that multinational companies or global area players that they are dealing with a higher scale of businesses in food distribution, they might have a very strict and solid team building around these topics. But smaller companies, they need support and guidance. So associations, the role of associations could be that they can support these companies and provide the necessary help and advice where to start or what to do with their help. As the company itself, as a small company itself, they need to start from making clear that their supplies are classified and grouped in a way that they can make very quick assessments. That's very important for small companies because they have that advantage to make quick assessments, which means that they can really save resources. And the regulatory team with the quality team usually are the ones that together they can spot exactly where to focus and choose where to start with.
Okay, so there's quite a role from the quality team, or maybe sometimes a merge with the regulator to decide themselves what will be their key focus in year one and then build from there. Great.
Correct.
We get a question in from Simidela. Okay, testing is critical. However, some countries do not prioritize the need to buy cutting-edge technology. How can CEOs be made aware to buy this material for testing?
Unfortunately, technologies might be expensive in one hand, but on the other hand, many times, or at least state-of-the-art methods, need also people. They need also expertise, how to deal with that, how to use it, and how to interpret data. It's not on the side of private companies usually. So food companies to develop or use internally these technologies, that's not usually easy to do, especially, as you said, for small and medium companies. This is not possible. But on the other hand, national laboratories are also not able to get access to all these technologies. We need to understand that this might refer to many technologies for many different topics and for many different categories. That means that when these 2 points are not available, so we cannot use a very fast and cheap screening method internally, our governmental laboratories are not able to cover up this need, either by not having the technology or not being able to perform it. And then we need to look to the side of service providers. And usually today there are, I would say, several private service providers all around the world in each country that they have the global access. So might be an international company in one country that they do not have the lab in that country, but they can and they have the possibility to send the samples all around the world in labs that they own in different parts of the world, perform the analysis and support the company locally. So that would be the way that I would look.
Okay, so if I hear you well, if I need to convince my CEO we need this type of testing, one, it can reduce cost in the longer term because you have, let's say, you can build up this trust relationship with your importing company or your retailer. Secondly, there are also costs if you need to hire service providers. So in that sense, your CEO can maybe judge, do you make your own investments or you rely on service providers? But again, I also hear you saying that staff internally also need training. So again, maybe tell your CEO or ask that you need, let's say, a training, because in the end, if you have good quality people in your company, it's so essential. And I've seen this. I worked for a multinational with excellent people from the quality department. They were trained in-house, additional trainings, and they can avoid a lot of trouble shooting in the company. And on the longer term, it's all about investing in your company.
Very correct point. And I would only add that usually CEOs might also be a little bit sensitive with listening to what might happen when the bad days come. So what might happen if fraud is identified without being in the internal procedures but identified externally, and this might be catastrophic. So thinking about what is the risk should include what is the consequence of that risk.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
so and internal investment on people is so important. Yeah.
So I think that's another answer, right? So it really anticipates upfront, like what might happen if you don't test and the risks of. Great, good. Maybe no more questions so far, but again, all for the attendees, write your questions down. We can answer them today or after the masterclass. Please go ahead, David.
Thank you. Let's have our next poll, which might bring a little bit more feedback from you.
Yeah, so maybe, again, we're keen to hear from you. What is the most important reason for not adapting of using verification testing? So is this because costs are prohibitive? The methods are too complex and not easily understood? The methods are not available in most parts of the world. So again, we're keen to hear what you think is the most important reason for not using this verification testing.
And this is exactly the point that we left the discussion in a few minutes ago. So it was that some issues in different areas or in different regions or sometimes in different companies might have the consequence that we're not adopting testing. And I didn't put the answer because of my CO here, but this could be included in one of these answers. And seriously thinking, apparently, either the costs or complexity of the methods or availability of the methods might be a very important reason.
Good. So we're keen to see the answers.
Okay.
All right. So I can see cost number 1. The methods are too complex or they're not available. Yeah, I think this shows also to me the picture. Like if I work on the globe in many countries like Nigeria, Ethiopia, Guinea, but indeed all the time I hear cost is a challenge. Indeed, methods are too complex, what I hear many times, or not availability many times as well, or like there are only a few laboratories available. David, what is your view?
Interesting that practically, or let's say simply statistically, the answers are split equally. So it's straightforward to think about costs, because either 1 cent or 1,000 euros or dollars, the result is the same. It might be additional costs in my budget, and that's an issue. Nevertheless, I would like to mention today that these kind of testings or this kind of analysis is not anymore in the scale that we used to have 10 years ago. The popularity of these methods had an impact that we have more labs performing, so the costs are lower. But of course, if the method is not available in my country, might be an issue for me, because I will not look further to find it. And here I would say again that I need to ask my service provider or the company that I trust to see if this method is available in another country, and they can help me to get access to it. Complexity, very important topic, because many of them are so-called non-targeted methods. So not one compound that I need just to quantify, but another way of result. And here I need also the support from my service provider, or I need the support of programs. Either it's a program from CBI, or it's a program from a certain national governmental agency that they can give more support and training on these topics.
Thank you so much. So again, let's move on to the part number 4. It's now we over an hour, but I think we're really going on time. And again, thanks for joining our masterclass on food frauds. We're now entering the part 4 about food authenticity, holistic approach. So keen what you mean with holistic approach. Mm-hmm. Again, there's time to ask questions already up front, so we can take them after this part.
Thank you. So we have seen from the previous masterclass and from this masterclass up to now, several activities, several actions that we can put in our procedures, in our companies, in our area of responsibility. And if you think back a little bit, you will probably identify that all of that starts from the quality of the job we have to do. How proper is the information that we can collect? How appropriate and specific is the knowledge we have about our industry, our product, or our region? How we can correctly build up programs and find support on solutions that we can use. But isn't that really relevant to how aware we are, how much engagement we show, not only personally, but also as stakeholders into the food industry? We start again from thinking about the criminal activity. So there is definitely in this global complex supply chain the impact of criminal activities that they are intending to adulterate food intentionally. And this is because they have economic advantages. And this will continue and probably will grow. And we need to defend ourselves, our companies, from that phenomenon. When we are thinking what we can do and to be prepared, as we said before, we need to use authentication. We need to use the solutions that they can verify the authenticity of the products we use or we produce and export as a tool. And the tool is to support the trust, not only to the consumer, not only to our buyers, but also internally in a company or in a sector in a certain country. Building trust means that people, let's say, cultivate their understanding of having safe and authentic food. So building this culture that in one hand will identify that there is a problem, which is called food fraud. It has risks, and these risks might have an impact, financial impact on my company or my sector. But on the other hand, I would like to find more tools, more weapons, let's say, to boost my exports, to build trust between the employees of the companies of as members of associations or national industries, and then to my buyers, to my partners in other places in the world that will distribute my product. Reading and collecting information is very important on that. So to build food culture or to build a better understanding and create motivation and engagement to people comes through, of course, webinars, masterclasses, and trainings, but also comes through reading the understanding of principles behind all the topics that we discussed in these masterclasses. It's quite important today that we have several sources to collect that kind of information. It doesn't refer only to very basic principles about what is food fraud or what is authenticity, or sometimes even to get deeper into certain techniques and technologies that we can use from the laboratory side. But also we have resources that they can help us understand the risks and the trends in certain segments, for instance, in herbs and spices or in natural ingredients. It can help us understand why food integrity is a global, holistic topic referring not only to food fraud, but also to food safety. But also a very important source of information comes from the actual publicly available certification standards, where they describe more or less in similar way what we need to do internally, not only to make sure that the food we produce is safe, but also that it is authentic, and what we can do internally to make the procedure compliant with these standards, and really raises the topic into several teams, as Louke mentioned before, into the quality management team, into regulatory topics, but also sometimes affecting the buyers or even the marketing parts of some companies. We see the slide that we've seen in the very beginning, and we spoke about authenticity quite a lot. But then again, each one of us that participate in this global structure, either starting from a very small company somewhere in one country producing one very specific product, versus on the other end a global distributor which purchases products from whole continents and bring them to the importing regions of the world, that we need to deal with the problems that affect our business and our lives every day, and they belong as pieces, as we said, of the same puzzle, having in the center the concept of food integrity. We expect, and we used to expect always, products of high quality, and of course products that they are safe to consume. But we also expect to buy something that really describes its claims over the product, and they are true, that we need to trust these products. And this is extremely important for the exporting companies, for the associations in countries that they are really depend on exporting their goods and their valuable products to markets all around the world. And we need to keep in mind that, unfortunately, the circulation of information around the world today, in one hand, is very fast, but on the other hand, might not be controlled properly as a matter of what it means and what is the consequence of that information. So we receive that information in different parts of the world, and we make assessments, we make decisions that might really affect a whole segment, a whole industry in a certain country or multiple countries, and we don't realize the impact of, let's say, overseeing that or cutting corners in procedures that they are very important for securing these topics. And from our experience, I would say that building up on trust needs the participation of multiple stakeholders. We mentioned before the companies, we've mentioned associations, we've mentioned governments. All of them, they have their role in that to make sure that the guidance is there, the motivation is really there, and the engagement, but also the actions are taking place.
Wonderful, David. I think a great summary. There's now time for questions and answers. David, might still ask you to go to the previous slide because I love this triangle. We get a question in from Tiziana. She's asking, do you think that chemical phenotypical testing should be used in parallel with DNA testings to provide stringent testing?
Well, a very specific question. Let me answer it a little bit more general. More testing related to certain topics might incur costs. We also receive many times the question, is this method enough? Because I was proposed also to do a second or a third method. The answer is very simple. If the topic that I want to identify by testing is not fully covered by one test and I need to make a second or a third, so not to replace but supplement it, the balance has to do with how much costs I will put into my system and what will be the benefit at the end. Usually, for deciding frequency of certain tests, we go to the scale like starting from cheap and very fast screening methods. These are not very relevant to very specific topics, but they are in this category of non-targeted. Sometimes, for instance, molecular testing could include NGS, next generation sequencing, which is really non-targeted. So I'm just looking for something, anything. I want to see the list of all bacteria in my product, or the list of all meat species or spices in my product. And then, if I need to do something very specific to identify a chemical contaminant, then I don't need to do molecular testing. I need to do a very targeted test to identify for certain chemical substances.
Thank you so much. We get a question in from Mira. Hi, David. How is it possible to authenticate if the claims on the labels are acceptable or fraud? How can we anticipate them to ensure the manufacturer is true?
Remember the slides that we had, maybe this one slide with this bar, very valuable bar with certain claims on the product. This could be a claim like you've seen it, or it could be a list of ingredients like bourbon vanilla, certain rum, or I don't know, oregano in there. Wouldn't taste too good, but anyway, let's say that these are the claims and the ingredients. If I understand the question, what we need to do to verify that these ingredients are really in the product and they are true. My first thought would be that we do the correct test, which can be performed either on the supplier level. So if I produce that bar, that means that I purchase these ingredients and then I use them to produce the bar. So what I can do is, first of all, to make sure that my internal procedure of production doesn't have too many pitfalls to have cross-contamination or even activities that are not accepted in this procedure. And additionally, I'm testing the supplier that they sold me bourbon vanilla, pure oregano, and certain rum from sugarcane.
Yeah, and maybe to be more specific, I think Mira also mentioned, let's say, like the manufacturing, they are doing something. So on the one hand, of course, you could test, like you can ask the manufacturer to test again. But so she's answering. So basically, we need to collect and test reports and production process flow and their supplier, COA.
Correct.
Yeah. So again, even though they are doing this. Okay, Simidele is coming in. In Nigeria, a lot of informal export happens. These products usually are not tested by the government agencies. Could you try to educate your client to purchase a product that has undergone a conformity assessment by the government?
Sure, of course. If the topic touches more the illegal trafficking of goods, which might include sometimes also counterfeiting of certain brands, this is a very important part of food fraud, and this is more relevant to governmental authorities and custom controls, how they can get this trafficking down, either by more controls or more actions that they can deter that activity. But of course, training or bringing more awareness to purchasers has to do with more or less trying to make sure that there are certain standards and requirements, certification standards, private standards sometimes, that certain companies have their own standards for that. And this might be a way. Nevertheless, we need to understand that illegal trafficking of goods doesn't always happen into the black market, let's say, because these goods will infiltrate the legal and the certified supply routes. So the problem is that we might have the problem that I'm trained enough to purchase trusted food from a certain supplier. The supplier might also be very well trained to get the goods from certain sources that they are trustful, but in between, the untraceable goods are getting into the supply chain, and this is very difficult to identify, either by controls or by testing. This can be a way to do it.
Thank you so much. Yeah. So again, anyone still some questions? I still have one question here. Like in the end, of course, we can see a lot of materials are exported, raw material exports, and companies have hardly a chance to add value. So for instance, there are ginger splits are sourced by importers because they don't trust the ginger powder. Mm-hmm. But how could you change this image of your sector to really show that you have powder that is true ginger and not with a lot of fraud?
Difficult procedure and takes time. When we have a damaged sector, I don't say that ginger is damaged, but I'm saying that when we are dealing with a product that we have identified as being victimized in the global markets, then the first thing is joining in consortia, could be through associations, for example, to build either a common or sometimes a national policy, how to promote that. We have seen in certain countries, and I'm sure that the CBI has supported these kind of activities from some countries and certain segments for certain products, to build up on joining together and developing programs that they can support the exports, and this includes also to increase awareness about being safe, being authentic, and so on. And some examples, like I've mentioned from experiences from the past, is that this needs to go to the end of the line. So it needs to get a full supportive program, which might have even a complete new marketing. It should include a very supportive joint effort from different companies, and it needs to have very innovative applications. For example, authenticity mark on a product, or extended testing that is an absolute proof to other markets of being 100% ginger, nothing else in there, although a powder. Or the ginger powder is not only 100% ginger, but it comes from that place of the world, from that country, and so on. So new, innovative, additional tools that they can complete a picture and give the value and build the trust.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Again, so it's collaboration. Benson raises an important point that there are, let's say, there are possibilities that analysis from even reputable laboratories are, let's say, their results are challenged. And again, like the export needs to do an additional round of testing. Could there be something they don't do right in their analysis, or why is this double testing done?
Could be, yes. Usually the first thing that we need to look is for trusted partners. Accreditation, for example, is one source of trust. So the laboratory should be compliant to certain ISO, the 17025 or others. Another is that we need first maybe to understand a little bit the method that has been proposed, even though we don't need to be all people in the technical area, but it's good that when we are not 100% sure about a solution that has been proposed, to get a little bit of understanding why this solution will help me and why the result will look like black or white or gray sometimes. I'm saying that because we also have several cases that a question sounds very simple, incoming question sounds very simple, but from our side, we can recognize the complexity behind. And to propose simply one test, again, might sound very easy, but it's not always, or mostly, it's not the correct way to just propose a test when the question refers to many topics. So this understanding is very important. Now, I cannot say other reasons that results might be wrong, but the only comment I can make is that it might happen that a laboratory didn't perform a test properly. I mean, the possibility is always there.
Yeah, so identifying the right methods. Wonderful. I can see we are 1 hour and 20 minutes already running the webinar. So David, first of all, I really want to thank you. I think like running this masterclass twice, we could go deeper in this round. I learned a lot that indeed you need to do a proper risk analysis, which really helps you to identify where you put like most focus and your resources as well. Then about doing a good vulnerability assessment is also leading to making your plan internally in your organization. So work on your quality department, work on your regulatory affairs, work on your management system internally. And again, if you want to build your country image, your sector, we need to work both with sector associations, with NGOs, consultants. We work with the regulatory framework. We work with the government bodies who can do both setting the standards as well do the enforcement. And I think that together should all lead better to integrity and better food authenticity. And the final point I want to make, you said also a lot about tools. So we need also more, I wrote it down, innovative approach, like work on traceability, work on barcodes, QR codes, good testing methods. That is all needed as well to build on this basically this pillar of integrity. So thank you for this. For all the people that joined, you will receive the PowerPoint slides. We will put this recording on our website, so you can also share it. For that ones that submitted your let's say homework, the Excel file, you get some short comments back as well. We appreciate that you made this. Very well appreciated. And then please, let's stay in touch. You can find both of us. You can find on LinkedIn, so you can link with us and keep track of what's going on. So David, thank you. I still see that there's one final question coming in, so let's maybe give you one more question to finish up this webinar. So it's coming in from Gianita. She's asking, how can sector associations also protect SME members that cannot comply with the authentication program due to budgets?
I think that I mean, this is more a little bit of personal opinion, that sector associations could definitely make or have the role of supporting the sector. That's the purpose, and that means that resources, or using properly resources, might be a task which can help some companies that they might have this kind of problem, or use practically resources. I'm not talking only about financial resources, but knowledge, experience, training to support the people in these companies in order to make more efficient procedures to proceed to authentication. So the sector associations are definitely having a very important role to collect this kind of resources of information, to find proper people maybe that they can be used to distribute the knowledge around, and this could be very much appreciated and very, very helpful for the smaller companies that they would need this support and that they cannot do that internally.
Great, thank you. Final question, is it possible to test all products to ensure the authenticity of a product? So maybe to test all the materials.
I mean, the answer is yes, but then you need to, of course, understand what is the question behind. So, for example, if someone wants to know where the brick powder comes from into my garlic powder, because I want to find where is the criminal coming from, this is not possible. But generally, all products can be tested. All issues of authenticity can be verified as long as we find the proper method or set of methods.
Wonderful, thank you. Then, yeah, let's close the session here. Thanks, David. I'm keen to hear more about, let's say, your journey in food fraud, food integrity, and food authenticity. And thanks for all the people that joined our sessions, and have a great day today.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you.